Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. This is Ideas, Ideas Everywhere, How to Choose an Idea for Your Novel. I'm Orbit's Publicity Director, Ellen Wright, and I'll be moderating the event today. This is the first in our virtual event series, How to Write Your First SFF Novel. Click on the green button at the bottom of the screen to see all the sessions and sign up for as few or as many as you like. They're all free and open to the public here on Crowdcast. This event will be recorded and a replay will be available after it ends at the same link you used to get here today. So if you enjoy the event, share the link with your friends. If you have to leave early, you can come back and watch the rest of the replay. We've got a fantastic panel lined up today. Clicking on that green button at the bottom of the screen will also take you to links to learn more about and buy these authors' books. James S.A. Corey is the pen name of Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank. In addition to writing the best-selling and award-winning novels and short stories of the science fiction series The Expanse, they also produced the television series of the same name. And separately, Daniel Abraham is also the author of fantasy novels, most recently Blade of Dream, Book 2 in his Kithmar trilogy. Fonda Lee is the World Fantasy Award-winning author of the Greenbone saga, starting with Jade City, and she is also the author of the award-winning YA science fiction novels Zero Boxer, Exo, and Crossfire. Rowenna Miller is the author of the Barnes & Noble speculative fiction pick, The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill, as well as the Unraveled Kingdom trilogy, which began with Torn. And Devin Madson is the Aurealis award-winning author of two epic fantasy series, The Reborn Empire, which began with Rewrite the Storm, and the Vengeance trilogy, which began with The Blood of Whisperers. So here's how the event is going to work. For the first 30 or 40 minutes, I'll be asking the authors questions for them to discuss, and after that, we'll be answering your questions. Click on the button on the right side of your screen with the question mark on it to access the Q&A section and submit your questions at any time during the event. You can also vote on other people's questions that you find interesting. We'll start with the top voted questions and may not get to everyone. I wish we could. By the way, please don't describe your own story ideas in the questions and ask our panelists to help you pick among them or anything like that. Keep your questions general. So the reason we gathered the four of you for this panel is that you all have the experience of having to choose an idea for a novel or a series more than once, but in different ways. Devin, you've written two series that are not only both epic fantasy, but both set in the same world, so you've had to be creative within those restraints. Rowenna, your debut trilogy was fantasy set in another world, and you followed that up with a standalone set in a past version of our world. Fonda, you've written for both adult and YA audiences, and you've written both science fiction and fantasy. Daniel, too, has written both science fiction and fantasy, and both solo and with a co-writer. And Daniel and Ty together, don't worry, no spoilers, are working on a new series following an enormous success, a New York Times bestselling series that won the Hugo Award for Best Series and was adapted into a TV show that ran for 6 seasons and also won multiple Hugo Awards. So I'm sure you felt absolutely no pressure to come up with an equally great idea for your next book. Let's jump in and talk about what novel ideas look like. From the outside, I think it's not always clear how detailed your initial ideas might be. So I'm going to first ask all of you, what would you describe as quote unquote, the idea behind your latest work? How much did you know before you decided to commit to the idea? Let's start with Fonda.
Okay, well, I'm not sure which of my latest works to pick out for an example. I feel like I've spoken a lot about how the Greenbone saga came to be, but and in short, all of my novel ideas come to me a little bit differently. The Greenbone saga started many years ago as 2 lines in a notebook, and all I had at first was vibes. So I had no characters, I had no plot, nothing. I just had vibes. I just had this idea for the world, really. And I wanted to mash together some things that I really loved, including like gangster drama, wuxia, kung fu films, family saga, and Asia-inspired fantasy in a modern setting. So I just had aesthetic more than anything else. And I knew sort of the heart of the story was a family saga. And from there, it was like an oyster accumulating material to get a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. And there was a bit of the world that would come to me, and then that would help inform a little bit of the plot, and the plot would help me develop some of the characters a little bit. But my most recent work that isn't even published yet, but it's going to be my next project with Orbit, is The Last Contract of Isako. And I have described it as a cyberpunk samurai space opera, but the way that this came to me was completely random. I was in the middle of writing the Greenbone saga, and I was at a con. I was in the con suite. It was, I don't know, maybe sometime around midnight, and we're eating Chex Mix with a bunch of other authors. And we just started talking, sort of joking around about how to come up with a science fiction idea. Because I'd mentioned, I want to write another science fiction project after I'm done with this massive epic fantasy trilogy. And we were joking about how you can pretty much come up with a science fiction idea by throwing anything in space. So we started just being ridiculous and being like dogs in space, janitors in space. And at some point I said samurai in space. And then I was like, yeah, but like I would actually want to read that. And I think I might want to write that. And that's all I had. So it actually, the idea evolved a lot. It's not really samurai in space. It's more like samurai on a colony planet that's more like a harsh environment like Dune, and they're not really samurai. There's sort of a cyberpunk element, but they're more like corporate retainers, and like little bits and pieces would start to accrete to the idea. And really, like other projects I've done have been like a single scene that's been in my mind, a character that's been in my mind, a plot twist or an element that's been in my mind, and then other pieces start glomming on.
Janitors in Space, that was a movie. I saw that movie. So they've done that too. I think I'll call on Daniel and Ty next. And I'm going to say probably the idea behind The Expanse is where we should go rather than the new series. I don't think we're supposed to be talking about that in this event yet. But everyone who's watching...
I can talk about the idea behind the new series without any spoilers.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, The Expanse and the new series have the same thing, which is all my ideas come from I'm reading some bit of history or mythology that I find really engaging, and then I go, but what if it was sci-fi? So the new series is just one of the stories I found really compelling as a kid. That is mythology, and I said, what if we just took that exact plot and structure and stuck it in space somewhere, as Fonda was saying, and that's where the new story comes from. I'm not going to talk as long because I don't have as much to say.
Daniel, anything to add to that? You're muted.
You're muted.
See, that was the very erudite bit. You missed it. Now, I wanted to agree with Fonda that what she said about it being less one single idea and more the accruing of thousands of little ideas that all speak to each other. That's my experience of it too.
Rowenna or Devin, does one of you want to jump in on this first? Rowenna, how about you?
Okay, I can go for it. So with fairy bargains, I think that the idea kind of came from, I was poking around at different, like you were saying, Ty, reading mythology and kind of like just, being a nerd as one is. And I kind of discovered a few different pieces of like fairy lore and different mythologies from different cultures. And I was like, well, the only logical explanation is clearly fairies are real. Like that must explain the consistencies across cultures. So I kind of started poking that idea, and I was like, okay, so like, but what if they were real? Like, how would that work? And then like my world building kind of like, if there's a magic system, you got to figure out the limits are, kind of kicked in. And I was like, well, what would have limited the fairy magic then from just taking over the whole world? And I said, okay, so we'll create a fairy, world in which there's a thin veil between some places, and it's kind of inconsistent. And obviously fairies are dangerous and tricksy, so you don't want to be too pushy with how you work with them. And so kind of creating a subculture of only some people really know about the fairies and are willing to work with them. And I was like, okay, this is fun. I could play with this. And where do I want to set this? And then decided to plop it into a historical context, because I kind of wanted to play with the idea of, well, at some point, we stopped believing stories about fairies. Why? And then adding a layer then of, okay, so themes of modernity and changing cultures and changing technology and things like that. So very similar to what you've all said so far. There's kind of like layers upon layers. You get like the initial seed, and then it kind of like, I think you're absolutely right, Fonda, that it's like the oyster, because it's like it kind of burrows and then it's like irritating, and so you have to keep coating it until it feels like, oh, that's a whole idea. I like.
Devin, how about you?
Yeah, I agree that it is very much like this accretion process, but I try not to get too hooked up on details too early, like Fonda said about vibes, because ultimately I find that if I use some particular element to keep myself motivated, as soon as I write that or I've finished working on that, I'm not motivated to keep working on the project anymore. And so I try to keep myself focused a bit more on the vibes for as long as I can, because that is what is actually going to sustain my interest in the project. You know, if I can kind of develop a real kind of love for the whole concepts or like the particular themes along the way, is what will actually make me finish something, because otherwise as soon as I write the thing, I'm done. Which is part of why this time for my new project that's not out yet, Between Dragons and Their Wrath, I decided to just put everything that I love in books into a book. And people say that, you know, that's often what they do, that they write a book that they would want to read. But I wrote a book I wanted to read last time, and I got sick of reading it. And so this time I thought, I really got to go a little bit further, because you have to read your book so many times through the editing process. I was like, no, it has to be things like everything that I love so deeply that I can't hate it by the end. We'll see how that goes. But, you know, so I was like, right, this is going to be a queer anti-capitalist manifesto with dragons and kissing, and we're done.
That leads nicely into one of my other questions, since you talked about your enthusiasm for the book, Devin. How do you know that a particular idea is the one that you want to move forward with? How much do you think about your personal excitement about an idea versus market viability? Are you considering how commercial an idea is before you start writing? Let's mix it up and start. Actually, Devin, why don't you start first, since you were talking about this a little bit?
I find this a really interesting question, because in a, you know, intensely capitalist world, the idea of being able to entirely separate like personal enthusiasm and market viability kind of doesn't work for me. You know, we have to consider the fact that like actually you can get personally enthusiastic about something that is market viable because it's market viable, because actually you might get paid, you know. So I do think that in order to actually really commit and get through a project, you do have to have more than market viability. Like I said, I've got to really be vibing with it, but finding some great kind of line in between where it's like, well, I love these things. Surely I'm not the only one who loves these things. So if I just do them 150%, surely that will make it something that other people also love. Kind of tends to be the way I think about it. I'm not online enough to follow market trends and things. I just sort of think about the conversations that me and my friends have and the books that we love, and I go, well, hopefully this one's market viable.
Daniel and Ty, what's your opinion on that?
I've actually got two answers on that one, and I will be quick so that Ty has any time. One thing is the best marketing advice I ever got, I got from F. Scott Fitzgerald, which was never marry for money. Go where the money is, then marry for love. I have sometimes had lists of things that ideas that I thought were fun and that I wanted to do at some point, and then I would look through those, or have an agent or somebody who knows better than I do look through one to give me an idea about the market. To choose on the list of things I already care about. But also I have to put in the caveat that everything that I have ever done with kind of steely market forces in mind has failed. And everything I have done that succeeded, I have done for shits and giggles. So.
Ty,
I think there's a conversation to be had here. This comes up in screenwriting a lot, which Daniel and I do a lot of now, with authenticity. Audiences can smell inauthentic work. And when you wrote something entirely mercenary just for the money, you don't care about it, you're just looking for a paycheck, that the scent of that comes off every page or every scene on screen. And when somebody writes something that they love, even if it's not a thing you would have thought you loved, the authenticity of their love for the thing pulls you in and makes you love it too. So I think a truly authentic work is much more likely to be commercially viable by the way it attracts people to love it the way you love it than anything you do with market forces in mind. Like, I'm going to write this genre because that's the hot genre, even though I don't care about that genre. That inauthenticity will absolutely come through on the page and everyone will see it.
That's great. Rowenna, how about you? What do you think about when you're evaluating ideas?
Honestly, it's a strange position to be in now for all of us, in that, like, at some point we sent it to an editor and they're like, nope. So there's that. Like, I got the safety net, right? Like, I'm no one's gonna let me write anything too far off the, like, that's just too insane. I want to stop doing that. But I do find it interesting that I probably have very weak like radar for market viability, because the project I'm working on now, just the one that my editor was like, yes, do that one. Yes, that thing. I was like, this is just too damn weird. No one's gonna want this. This is, this niche, goofy thing that only I would be interested in. And I think that sometimes that niche, goofy thing that only you could be interested in is actually interesting to a lot of people. And what I think about, I think more than maybe market viability, is can I communicate this idea to an audience? Like, at the end of the day, writing is communication. I'm not writing solely for myself, even if it's an idea that I'm really excited about, because someone's going to read it. So do I have a vision for this that I can communicate what I'm trying to do, in terms of the story, and any themes or ideas I want to play with, like, like Devin was saying, anti-capitalist manifesto with dragons. Like, I think you've got a pretty clear picture of what you want to communicate. Like, you've got that to go. So, so yeah, I think about that more than straight market viability, just because I know my limits, that I'm not very strong at that.
Fonda, anything to add?
In terms of choosing a project, I never jump on an idea right away. I know that the project that I'm meant to work on is the one that sticks to me like a leech, whether or not I'm working on it or not. So if I have a cool idea, I might be like, oh, that's a cool idea. And I think about it in the shower, and 2 or 3 days later, I've forgotten about it. Then that's not the project. The project is the one that has been sitting around in my mind for months, years, usually, because that's the one that I'm going to have the interest in, and the motivation to work on for what will be years. And especially if you're writing a series, like pretty much all of us on the screen are, you're looking at half a dozen years of your life, minimum. And so you've got to love this. This has to be the idea that makes you want to pee your pants a little bit, because it's that exciting to you. Otherwise, it's going to be a long slog. It has to be something that you have the fire for. And in terms of market viability, I don't really think about, as others have said, market viability is a funny thing, because if you love it that much, odds are you are not a special snowflake, and that there are people out there who are going to want to read that thing that you also wanted to read enough to actually write. The key is going to be finding those people. So it's less about market viability than it is about having a clear position in your mind of what is this story, and how can I kind of communicate what it is in a relatively quick and easy way, so that people who are going to like it as much as I do will find it. At the end of the day, I think of like what I should write next as being like a Venn diagram. So one circle of that Venn diagram is stuff I really want to write, and the other circle is stuff that people want to read. And I'm trying to hit that overlap in the Venn diagram. And fortunately, I think that overlap is generous enough that there's, you don't have to worry too much about trying to write something that you don't love, because that's just not going to be fun for you. It's not going to, be the reason why you sit down and type every morning.
If I may add one thing to agree with what everybody else is saying, and the fastest way to make your story nothing is to try to make it all things to all people. So if what everybody's saying about having the thing you really want to write, the anti-capitalist dragon story, or the martial arts samurai on another planet story, like if you're trying to make it appeal to every possible audience member, it will appeal to 0 audience members. It just becomes mush.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ty. I know that every author's favorite question is, where do you get your ideas? I'm going to ask a variation on that. If anyone watching this has not attended many author events, that is extreme sarcasm. This is a question that authors always get and always struggle with. But I know that some of you have drawn inspiration for your books from your expertise and specific life experiences. For example, Fonda, you're a black belt martial artist, and the Greenbone Saga incorporates martial arts. Rowenna, you're talented at sewing, and the protagonist of the Unraveled Kingdom series is a seamstress. So how often do your ideas come from something that you've experienced directly versus more general brainstorming? Or is there something else besides life experience that leads you to ideas? Fonda and Rowan, I already picked on you once, so I'm gonna do it again. Fonda, do you have anything to say on this topic?
Yeah, I think that as authors, we put something of ourselves in everything that we write. It might be personal experience. It might be, it might be something in another career we had, previously. It might be other media that we really love. A lot of my inspiration comes from other books, also movies and television shows that I love, and I'm like, I want to do something that makes me feel like that. Also things that are kind of obliquely interesting to you that you want to find an excuse to research is a great way also to find inspiration, because oftentimes writing a book for us is like an excuse to really go down a rat hole for something that's just personally interesting. So I think it can be a combination, and usually is a combination of all of those things. I think what personal experience does, though, that's very helpful, is that when you get to the parts of the story or you're writing the character that draws on your own personal experience, it feels like you just get, like, I don't know, plus 10 stats to like your writing ability in that moment, because you're like, okay, like I have hit, a fight scene. I can see this clearly in my mind. I know how to block it out. Or like if I have a scene with a boardroom meeting, I've been in plenty of boardroom meetings in my previous life. I'm like, okay, I know how this works. So that's like kind of the moment where you feel like you get a little bit of a speed boost. But then, there's always the parts where you're like, I need to find experts. I need to research my ass off because I do not know what I'm doing here. And they kind of balance each other out.
Yeah, I think that in terms of like, the initial idea or coming up with the ideas, that whatever like personal things that you're passionate about moves you into like orbits of, and no pun intended, into orbits of, reading and being aware of and following and digging into, interesting stuff to you. And I don't know, I assume for most of us, the things that we read, encounter, touch, see, all of that serves as inspiration, whether, overt, where it's like I saw this thing and I want to do something that's related to it, or just kind of like this latent, building up of kind of like this rich inner library of stuff about and things that influence what you think about. So I do think that, I think that sometimes people worry like, oh, if I want to be a writer, but man, I've been spending all this time at the stables riding horses, or I spend all this time gardening, and that's not really helpful to like it. In a way it is. It's you're layering in this kind of rich inner life that you're going to pull from in one way or another, whether it's a direct inspiration of an idea or something that you're going to layer in and add richness and depth to an idea that might seem totally unrelated, but it's probably not.
Ty, it sounds like you get ideas from reading history.
I do. History and mythology, especially pre-classical history, is my favorite period. And the nice thing about pre-classical history is everybody else seems to focus from the Roman Empire forward. So if you write about Babylon, like a tiny number of people know what you're talking about. So you get to steal directly, and very few people will know that you stole it because nobody reads about that stuff. But I would say that for plots, almost never draw from personal experience. But for characters, you draw almost entirely from personal experience. Every character is some aspect of you, or somebody that that you understand well. I mean, they all are. But I've never been a spaceship captain, so very few plots come from my personal life.
You haven't? I thought you had been.
Sadly.
Devin, do you have anything to add on the subject?
Yeah, I've also, never been a warrior on horseback or anything, so I haven't drawn many of my main characters from my experience. But I tend to just, it definitely comes from like random little things that I really enjoy. Like I went through a period of really enjoying watching, I can't even remember its name now, that Netflix show about glass blowing. I got really, really into that. And so suddenly I have this main character who is a glass blower, and she puts poison into glasses because I had to make it fantasy-like. So I don't experience the things personally, but I watch them on TV and then I put them into my books. They've got a bit of an experiential barrier. I guess there's some of my themes, things that I get from. So I've been studying philosophy, and so a lot of the themes come from kind of sort of this deep looking at the human experience from like a philosophical point of view has really come in a lot in the last little while, and I find that really, really enriching. Again, not my personal experience, but the experience of learning from a lot of people about life in general. I don't know. I don't have much to add, I think.
So what about previously rejected ideas? Have you ever said, no, I'm not going to write this idea. This is something that's not worthwhile, and then come back to it later? And if so, what changed in the meantime to make it the right idea when it wasn't before? I'll let anyone jump in who wants to, because I don't actually know if any of you have done this.
I'll jump in because I definitely have had ideas that I rejected for a novel because it was just too small or too thin. It wasn't something that I could see working with for years and years. But oftentimes those little ideas end up being great short stories. So I'll often get, if I get asked to write a short story, I'll go back to kind of the novel reject pile, and I'll be like, oh yeah, there was that one thing that I thought was cool, and I think I could turn this into a short.
Yeah, one of the things that Ty says, and that I think he's very smart about, is that for an idea to work in a story, there have to be two ideas. There have to be two things in conversation. And so I've had some things where I had like one idea. I like, this would be really cool, but it's just not enough. And then later on, something else comes along that kind of speaks to it and it dimensionalizes it, gives it some enough depth and enough complexity that it will support a narrative that it just didn't have before. I can think of a couple of times that's happened. I don't know if it was for novels particularly. I don't think I got back to them yet, but they're on the board. So it's as close as I got.
I was saying,
I've had one.
Go ahead, Dev.
Sorry.
Dev.
Yeah, I've had one where it was more about my personal skill, where it was like I have this idea that is, and I've been working on it. It was one of my very, very early ideas when I was younger, and I worked on it and I worked on it and I worked on it, and it never really got anywhere. And I came back to it, and it was, I still, even after working on it for months, it was still too big for me. It felt too much like I personally felt out of my depth trying to work on this idea. And so I will be interested ultimately coming back to that again in the future to see if my skill level increases, allows me to work on it again. So that was an interesting experience.
All right.
I definitely have one of those. I have my Roger Zelazny weird prose story that I want to tell, and what I have discovered is I am not Roger Zelazny. So I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait until I become Roger Zelazny, and then I'm gonna write that story.
I think it was interesting what Fonda was saying earlier, but you carry ideas around for months or even years before you actually write them. And I don't know that I have any ideas that I've rejected, but I've had ideas and I'm like, you're just not ready yet. That I've carried this around. It's not quite there yet. The project I'm working on now that isn't announced, I don't know how detailed it can be, but it was really like kind of two ideas I was carrying around for a really long time and didn't realize that they were actually like they needed to go together. And so I kind of kept putting them back on the shelf and putting it back on the shelf and saying, like, I don't know what to do with you. And then all of a sudden I realized, I know exactly what to do with you. You two need to get in the same bin, and now I can write you. So I think sometimes it's not a case of rejecting as much as it is like it needs to go back and marinate a little while longer. It's got to go back in the proofing oven. I don't know, whatever metaphor you want to use.
Yeah, sometimes it's just not right time, right place for that story too. Like maybe I have an idea. I do actually have an idea for like another huge fantasy series, but I'm like, you know what? I just finished one, and I think I'm going to hold on that one for a little while, right? Or like, whatever is the next project it might be a lot to do with kind of where your head is at as a writer. So ideas don't really ever die. They just kind of go into like cold storage.
All right, we have a lot of great audience questions. We're definitely not going to be able to get to all of them, but let's move over to some of those now. First off, Jocelyn asks, how do you go about judging the scope of an idea? That's whether a story is better suited as a short story, a standalone, or worth expanding into a series. Does anyone have any thoughts?
I would say that Daniel and I are very bad at that because we went to write a one-off novel and wound up writing 9. So yeah, I think we fail hard at that question.
So that said, I think one of the ways that you find out is you try and fail. I mean, the process of writing is in itself also a process of thinking and of exploration and of discovery. And sometimes, you're halfway through your first chapter and you think, oh, fuck, that was the ending. And then you have a short story. And maybe you don't know that until you put your hands on it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I had a novel that kind of petered out, and then I re-examined it from the perspective of trying to turning it into a novella, and then it just like all the cards fell into place because I hadn't right-sized it yet. But I think as you get more experienced, and we're all now at a point where we have multiple books under our belts, you kind of have an instinct for it. Like you develop a sense of like this roughly the size of the canvas that you are envisioning when an idea comes to you. And sometimes, it ends up, maybe you start writing a short and then more stuff starts happening and you're like, oh, I guess it's evolved and now it's longer, or, vice versa.
Yeah, I think it's also getting used to the way your brain works. Sorry, Daniel. Because like my brain can't do short stories. It just really fails at short stories. Everything just keeps getting bigger when I work on them. And so I've gotten used to the fact that it's really unlikely that it will be a short story, and it's really unlikely that it will be a novella, and it's probably unlikely it will be a standalone book, because this is just the way my brain works.
It's probably also why you have a lot of sci-fi fantasy novelists that you'll see them writing a lot of things in the same world, because like it is okay to experiment and discover, like, in fact, this germ of an idea produced, 3 novels, a couple novellas, a bunch of short stories. Like that's the process, I think.
Okay, our next question is from Jana, who asks, do you have tips for developing or fleshing out ideas? I find that I come up with a lot of story premises or else I'm inspired by concepts that I learn about, such as rogue planets, but struggle to build them into something I can actually write a novel about.
Yeah, you need a second idea. Yeah, there's a rogue planet, but what is going on that, what is the rogue planet a way to discuss some other idea? What about rogue planets is a way to discuss some other idea? You have a character who's feeling lost in their own life, and so the planet becomes a metaphor for what they're dealing with, and the two play off of each other. It's a story. This is what Daniel was saying earlier. A story is never one thing. It's never, if it's just one idea, then there's no friction in it. There's no way to create emotional drama out of it. You need a second thing rubbing against the first thing and creating all the friction that stories come from. That would be my answer.
This may be another way of saying the same thing in a more particular direction, but I would say who is in this story and get to know them. That if you have an idea about the characters, live with them for a while and see what bugs them. What are they up against? What do they care about? And you'll start to see more story, I think, developing when you start to look at it through characters' eyes, and especially also in terms of relationships. What relationship do they have to their world? What relationship do they have to their social, cultural, environment that they're in? What relationship do they have to other people? And kind of sit with it and like make them talk to you if you can. Buy them a drink.
Anyone else have something to add on that? Or should we move on to the next one? Okay, next question is from Casey, who asks, is there a process used to test your ideas before you start writing? I know that there are some authors, this is Ellen saying this, not Casey, who will write a short story in a universe before they start writing the novel to test it out. Is there anything like that that you all do?
Nah, I pretty much just go in and see if it fails or not.
Yeah,
That's
pretty
yeah.
much- that's pretty much what I was going to say.
The only like tiny test I have is I will write a pitch before I start writing the whole thing, because if I can't say what I want to say in a pitch, then it's probably my idea's not there yet.
Mhm.
Not that, there's anything wrong with the idea, but I haven't baked it long. So that is the one test that I do, and then I dive in and sink or swim.
That's actually a really good idea. When you get into screenwriting, there's the classic elevator pitch, and you do an elevator pitch for your book. That would excite somebody to read it. That's an interesting way to attack it.
Yeah, I think there's a built-in process as well for those of us who are established with publisher editor and often are selling our next projects on proposal, where the test is you actually have to write the proposal. Right? So that's kind of the built-in mechanism.
Well, you all pretty much just answered this next question too, but I'll see if anyone has additional thoughts. Joseph asks, would you recommend starting writing with short stories and novellas, or should I attempt to dive in and start writing with the intent of writing a novel?
If you want to write novels, just write novels. I think that if you like to write short stories, then by all means, write short stories. But writing the short story is not some sort of magic on-ramp into writing the novel, because they are different mediums. They're different skill sets. Writing a short story is very difficult for me compared to writing a novel. And so I don't think that one follows immediately from the other. If you have a novel idea, it needs to be a novel. Just write the novel, unless you really want to write short stories, and then have at it.
I will
Go when you're ready.
offer the counterpoint of it's especially when you're starting off. I think it's easier to fail writing short stories because you can just do it faster.
Right.
You can write
try
a bunch
fail
of,
cycle is fast.
Yeah, no, you can fail a lot quickly, which is really useful sometimes. If your novel fails, that took you a year. If your short story fails, like you could do that in a weekend. You could have a terrible short story just in a minute. That's the closest I can give to a counterpoint on Fonda. Basically, the point that you should write what you want to write. She's right.
Okay, the next question is from Jenna, who asks, how do you organize all of your ideas? Do you use certain programs, formats, etc.?
I have a whiteboard full of gnomic phrases that only I know what they mean.
I find it laughable that anybody thinks I have ever organized anything in my life.
I'll do random things. Like I have, a giant poster board, and I'll kind of brainstorm on it. I write in Scrivener, so I'll just open a file and start like dumping images into it. I have put Post-its on a wall. I've had complicated timeline spreadsheets. So it's just kind of whatever I need for that given project.
If when I have ideas, I kind of dump them into like just a Word document and just kind of like this idea and this thing, and just kind of like collect them, and then they get saved in like one folder in my documents. And then an idea, when I'm actually going to write it, it graduates from that folder and it gets its own folder. So that's the closest I come to organization, is that I have a graded system that my ideas get to graduate from like the idea dump folder into getting like their own folder.
I love that, Rowenna. That's great.
Mine will have their own notebook, because I get so excited about a new idea that I'm like, it gets a notebook. And I have a lot of notebooks lying around, and then I forget about them. And then I have the joy of going, oh, I need a new notebook, and trying to find one that's empty. And then you go through and you go, oh, I remember that idea. That was really good. And repeat cycle. Very organized.
Devin, can I ask, how many notebooks do you have that only have writing on the first page?
Look, I usually get to about 4 pages of just, because I'll like get to a couple of characters and things. But yeah, there's a lot of notebooks that only have 4 pages. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel seen.
There's a lot of documents that haven't graduated from the idea dump folder. So.
All right, we have a couple questions that are very overlapping, so I'll ask these at the same time. One is, how do you know when to draw a line on researching, especially if the research bit seems overwhelming, and switch to actually writing the idea that you have? And the other similar one is, how do you know when you have enough accreted ideas to start a functional outline, or however you start your writing process?
All right, I think the silence here is speaking volumes.
I love the concept. So, there's a point that you can stop. Because it's like a cycle.
We're all wondering, like, how.
I'll kind of like start with like some preliminary research if I don't have enough basis, and then I like start writing about it. I'm like, oh, now I need to go find out about this, and then I'm back to the library. And the incredibly patient librarians at my university library like know me by now, and they're like, oh, you're back. Great. But it's I don't know that there's necessarily a like hard and fast like research phase or idea phase for all of us. Like I think for a lot of us it's very cyclical that you're moving through those. You kind of keep adding, and I mean at some point you do have to put the books down and actually start something out on the keyboard. But for me that's when I feel like I can get a few pages without having another question. So
I do give myself a deadline. So I have a development phase where it's like, okay, I'm just brainstorming, I'm doing free writing, I'm researching, I'm absorbing as much as I can, and then I give myself a deadline where it's like I am going to start writing on this date, and that way I can't actually just continue to spiral into the hole of research. But I know that it's not like the research is done by that date. It's just I have hopefully enough to get going. And I know it's going to, like Rowenna said, be a sort of a cyclical process. The other thing for me is I know the end before I start writing. And I know writers differ in this way, but for me personally, I won't start writing until I know where the story ends. And then I've got my destination in mind. I may not know how I'm getting there. I may only know kind of a few waypoints along the way, but if I can see that ending, that's when I feel like I'm prepared to start writing.
That's one way in which our process is very the same, because I can't write a word until I know where I'm going to end up. I can't do it. Can't even start. This has come up. This has been a problem for Daniel and I, where we're a little fuzzy on the end, and he wants to start, and I can't do it. Like I just can't write a word until I know where I'm going. But I will say that listening to all this, the thing that people are often looking for is the magic flowchart that teaches you how to be a writer. And what you're hearing from a bunch of different people who are all very successful is it's messy. There's no magic flowchart. It is you start, and maybe it's a short story, or maybe it's a novel, and maybe I should do some research, or maybe I'm ready to write right now. And no project follows a strict, like it's the same steps every time. It's just whatever worked that time, whatever was in your head that time, whatever came out of that project. And every project is very different from every other project you'll do, and every project you do will be very different from every project anyone else has ever done. It's just very messy.
I think you're right. I think there's this fantasy of dignity that we actually know what we're doing or how we did it, and it's much more embarrassing than that in actual practice.
That might be reassuring to some people, I'm thinking. So here's another question that a couple of people asked. We talked earlier about whether you prioritize your own enthusiasm or commercial viability for whether you decide to do a particular idea or another. But we've got a couple of people who are asking if you have multiple ideas that you're excited about for different works that are not intersecting, how do you decide which one to write or which one to write first?
I really struggle with this. And honestly, I kind of work on multiple projects at the same time because I'm a terrible person. and I kind of allow myself to do this because they are slightly different genres. You know, I will work on a fantasy thing, which always has to take priority because I actually have a contract for this one, versus you know, working on like a contemporary lit idea or a romance idea or something else. And I find that it's good for my brain. You know, I think everybody's going to have a completely different process, but for me, it allows that continuous sense of play and discovery, because it's not just I am sitting down to work. Obviously, that's not going to work for somebody who doesn't have a lot of spare time to do their writing in, and they have to really focus. In which case, you know, I can only do that because I have a contract. I don't know how you would do it if you didn't actually have a responsibility. So hopefully someone can answer that part.
Well, I actually went through a situation very recently where I had two ideas, and I didn't know which of them to propose to my editor. So I proposed both of them. I wrote up proposals for both, and I sent them to my agent. I sent them to my editor, and they were like, but they're both good. We like them both. Just write both of them. And so I really had, I felt very stuck between these two projects. And it ended up coming down to just like, on balance, which one do I feel like doing more? And what tipped the scales for me was that I had my other idea was a fantasy series, and I had just come off of a fantasy series, and I felt like, hey, this is kind of the perfect time. If I want to keep writing both fantasy and science fiction, it feels like the right time for me to go to a science fiction project. And it's a shorter project than this other fantasy series that I have in mind. So it kind of feels like the right one. So it again, back to what we were saying, sort of right time, right place. And many of us will, if we're struggling between ideas, we'll be also leaning on agents and editors to kind of help guide a little bit.
It strikes me this is really a time management question more than an inspiration or a craft question. It's how do you find time to write all of the stuff you want to write? And I don't think there's a wrong answer to that one. I don't think there's a right answer, unless you're not able to finish. If it's keeping you from getting finished, that's probably the wrong path. I mean, I think what Devin was saying about the sense of play and joy that comes from having multiple things and being excited and not being so disciplined that you've taken all the juice out of it. I think that's really wise. But we also need to finish. That's the tension.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting position to be in, like before you've published, because you have an incredible amount of freedom that you don't have necessarily. And hearing us all talk about, well, I have to focus on this idea because I have a contract for it, and so that has to be what I have to focus on. So a lot of our decision making gets made for us by a lot of different circumstances, whether it's what we sold or what's, you know, I'm at this point in my career, and so this is what's expected out of me next, or whatever. And so in some ways, you know, before you've hit that point of publishing and deciding what ideas you want to, you know, write, and do I want to write two things at the same time, and do I want to, you know, have a main project and a back burner project, like, experiment with that stuff, because now's when you learn how to write, like not just how to write, like the craft of writing, but how you as a writer function best, because you won't necessarily have that you know, flexibility and freedom later. Which doesn't answer the question of which project to pick, except that maybe you don't have to pick one, or maybe you learn how you do pick one by picking one, and it being the right or wrong answer, and that's okay, because you're in a position that you can make that minor error and then course correct and learn how to make a better choice next time.
Okay, our next question is from Sarah, who asks, how do theme, character arc, and world building impact your overall idea? Do you need all of these before you feel an idea is ready to write?
I don't understand any of those terms. I think when we start talking about taxonomies like even plot and character, I think those are useful as analytic terms. I'm not sure how useful they are as functional terms in the creative moment.
I think if the question is like, do I have a checklist where it's like theme, check, characters, check, plot, check? No, like I don't. I just have a story in my mind. But plot, character, and world and themes are all interacting with each other as part of the writing process. So if you follow a cool plot thread, you are naturally going to discover something about your characters. If you dive into your characters, you're going to learn something about the world, because your characters don't exist independently of their world. They are a product of their upbringing and the culture and society that they're a part of. If you do a good job telling the story, the themes are going to bubble up naturally with no extra effort, right? Because they're going to come from you, and these characters in the world and the plot are naturally going to produce some themes. And then people will tell you what those themes are, like after the fact. And maybe you can use that information to tease those themes out a little bit more during the revision process. So it's not kind of like a very mechanical thing. It's more just like, do I have a story? Like, is the story feel like it is something that I can now put on paper? And I think that in the process of writing, and actually the process of revision especially, is where you kind of start seeing where things are a little shaky. Like maybe you realize, oh, hey, my plot is a little bit shaky. But that's like, that may also just be a function of like, oh, I don't know the characters well enough. And again, like you go kind of back around and around in a circle.
Again, what I'm hearing is that it's really messy.
Exactly. I was just going to say, I start out, I know my characters like fairly well. Like I know the world they're living in enough to write it. There's a plot, hopefully. But I surprise myself a ton along the way. It's very messy. Like I don't realize that I'm writing these themes until I've gotten 2/3 of the way through the book. And I'm like, well, I'm going to have to go back and make that a little clearer from the beginning, because I just discovered that this is in fact, a lot of these words we use like theme, character arc, they're backwards looking terms that we realize later, like, oh, I did that. And I'm going to have to, like you're saying, Fonda, bring it out more in revision.
And I will say specifically to that point, some of the things like what the theme of the book was, sometimes your reader will tell you that and you go, oh, you're right. That is what I was writing about. I totally didn't even realize it as I was writing it, but now everybody's reading the book and they're going, oh, well, clearly they were writing about this. And so, I mean, obsessing with having that answer at the beginning, I think is counterproductive. As Rowenna said, a lot of it's revealed in the writing. And I think also a bunch of it, you don't know this yet, but a bunch of it's going to be revealed in the reading.
Okay, the next question is from Griffin, who asks, do you have any advice for writing trilogies or a series without feeling like you have to stretch your ideas just to fill pages? I want to work on a trilogy, but the idea I have feels too small for filling the pages of a third book.
I would say put everything, smush everything forward, and then come up with new ideas. This idea of like trying to stretch an idea is really going to make it feel thin. But if you compress it, obviously not too much, but, make sure that it fits so it feels the right size. And then the story still needs to continue. You just bring in new ideas. So it's just always better to write it to the size that it feels rather than trying to stretch a story. Because there's always new ideas. The characters always have new directions. There's always new elements of the plot to draw on, or there isn't, and in which case it's just a standalone story and you haven't stretched it. It's just going to fit the size that it is.
I think a nice tight 2-book series is much more interesting than a bloated 3-book series.
Here's an interesting question from Jocelyn, who asks, do you ever purposefully save ideas for later, maybe because you don't have the skill currently to execute the idea?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The skill or the time.
Right.
I mean, those are kind of the two that have been the rate limiting steps for me.
Like Greenbone Saga, I came up with it years before I wrote it. I just knew that I didn't have the writing chops for it yet.
I had a really lovely horror novel that I had I like an outline for it, but I just never had the time to do it. And then the world kind of did the plot, and it was like, well, too late for that one. So that I've lost.
Was it a pandemic story, Daniel?
Yeah, it was a combination of a pandemic story and a rise of fascism story, and it was like, well, this is gonna, this wasn't what it was about, but now that's how it's going to be read.
But now it's historical fiction, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
There's the way that this would have been read in the 90s. It's not going to be read now. Gone.
And I'm still waiting to turn into Roger Zelazny before I write one of my ideas.
So Diane asks, how do you keep from being derivative when you're being inspired by something that you've read?
Okay, let me answer this one. You're derivative. We all are. It's okay. Just lean into it. Be derivative. Because the thing is, if you write about the things you love from the things you've read or the things you've watched, and you put your passion into it and your excitement about it into it, it will not be the same as those things. It will be filtered through you. And you are not the same as everybody else. So when it's filtered through you, the thing that will come out is different. And stop worrying about it. Now, obviously, don't name your characters after the characters in somebody else's book. Don't do that. That's a bad idea. Don't steal their plot. But it's okay to steal almost everything else and filter it through the way you would have written it, and you're going to wind up with a completely different thing. And I hear this all the time. People are scared, like, I don't want to be derivative. Unless you are stealing directly the plot or directly the character names or those sorts of things, it isn't. It's your version of those things, and it's okay.
I can also promise that once you have written something and published it, people are going to, in your 1-star Goodreads reviews, accuse you of being derivative of stuff you have never even read or watched.
Oh, yeah.
So they're going to read it and they're going to be like, this is a ripoff of this thing. And you're like, what? I have no idea what I am supposedly ripping off. Because, there's not really any new stories, right? There's just new combinations of ideas. And the combination of ideas and the voice is what you're bringing. If you give the exact same story to 6 different people, they're going to write it 6 different ways.
I actually have a reading list of things that I have supposedly ripped off that I have never read before. But I'm like, well, if they think I ripped it off, it's probably something I would like.
Right.
So I've made myself a reading list of those things.
So I think some of you might be interested, I'm going to do a little plug here, might be interested in one of our upcoming panels, which is called Taking Inspiration from Classic Stories. I just popped the link to that event in the chat if anyone wants to register for it. But
by
for this
classic
panel,
stories, we mean Babylon 5.
Yes, that is
yes.
a classic of the genre. There you go. For this event, we are pretty much out of time. I'm going to ask. I won't answer it. One more audience question that is a little separate from ideas, but I think that this is a good place to wrap up. Holly asks, how do you get over self-editing and just do the damn thing? I find I'm getting better at getting the words down, but still suffer from editing myself to the point where it may be taking away from getting ideas out there.
My advice there is just to lower your standards. Like whatever standards you think you have, just lower them further. If you think that this is a first draft and your first draft has to be good, just don't even think of it as a first draft. Think of it as a 0 draft, a -1 draft, like you're just glorified outlining. Whatever it is, to be okay with what you're writing, and I just remember you can't fix something that's not there yet.
And if we're talking self-editing, as in like you keep going back and revising your own work, which is I think what you mean by this, maybe you recognize that that's part of your process and work it into your process, because that is how I work. I will go through several chapters and then I'll go back and kind of like rework some things if I recognize that they're not working. I don't write a complete first draft and then go back and fix it. For me, it's sort of cyclical. If you recognize that about yourself, you can lean into it and work with it instead of fighting it. And put limits on it. Say, okay, I'm going to, what works well for me is to read the page I wrote yesterday, make some tweaks, and then keep going and write a few more pages, and then I kind of keep doing that, or whatever it is that works for you. Learn how you write, because you don't write like anybody else writes.
You can also reframe the game. If the game is not to turn out a good chapter, but to turn out 500 more words today, then even if they're crap words, you still won because you got your 500. When I was first selling short stories, I reframed it as ping pong between me and the magazines, and as long as I had something in the mail, I was winning. It was and that allowed me to do that. If there's a way to change the thing that you're trying to achieve away from quality just for a minute, and give yourself a little space to play in. I made that up. That might not work. I don't know.
I write when I'm really tired. I write when I'm so tired that part of my brain is just turning off. So that's how I do it.
It works really well for him. The stuff that he does at 3 a.m. is pretty good stuff.
Okay, we're definitely out of time. I think my 3 takeaways from this event are: combine 2 ideas, writing is messy, and lower your standards. Great advice from our panel of authors. Thank you everyone for attending. If you haven't already, you can sign up for more sessions in the How to Write Your First SFF Novel series by clicking on that green button at the bottom of your screen. You can also buy all of these authors' books there. Follow us here on Crowdcast to be notified about other upcoming events. The recording of this panel will be available in a few minutes on the same page, so if you enjoyed the event, please share the link with your friends. Again, thank you for attending and for your great questions. Thank you to Daniel, Ty, Fonda, Rowenna, and Devin for sharing your wisdom. Good luck with your novels, everyone.